evening, and today I would like to talk with you about how the food sector, and particularly agriculture, can make a positive contribution to biodiversity. And I will do this from a governance perspective. So I will look at the interactions between involved parties, like governments, farmers, food processors, retailers, consumers, and conservation NGOs. And I will start with a very big picture. I will talk about biodiversity globally and trends in biodiversity. And then I will zoom in. I will look at the Netherlands and what global commitments to biodiversity recovery made in Melbourne last year will mean for our little country. Then I will zoom in a little bit more and zoom in into agriculture. What can agriculture do to bend the curve for biodiversity loss? And then my colleague Dorine Rijmakers will take over and zoom in a little bit more even to look at what universities can do, and particularly the University of Utrecht. And then we'll have questions and cocktails, and of course you don't have to wait with the cocktails. You can, of course, also take cocktails if you want during my presentation. So very briefly, the problem. So I'm not an ecologist. I know of the trends. I will not discuss them in detail, but just to sketch the bigger picture. As you know, we have an enormous decline in biodiversity. And biodiversity is the diversity and abundance of species worldwide. So it's about species populations, but also their geographical distribution and genetic diversity. Yeah, I guess you all have heard about the enormous decline in insects a few years ago. There was a study from a nature reserve area in Germany where 75% decline in biomass was observed in only 25 years. It was in a nature reserve area. It wasn't even an agricultural landscape. But it had quite some impact because many people also recognize this. People like me, when I was young, we drove to south of France, and you had to clean your car when you arrived in the south of France because it was full of insects. Nowadays, you don't see those insects anymore, so it was very recognizable. But you also may have heard of headlines like 1 million species at risk of extinction. You may have heard of the 6-month extinction, and this time man-induced. So there's really something going on here. And personally, well, I've been on this planet for 52 years. And last week, when I read the Living Planet by WWF, I once again was struck by the news that in this period that I'm on this planet, we lost 69% of the population size of mammals, of birds, of reptiles, etc. So it's really remarkable what's been happening, particularly over the last 50 years. But okay, I mean, we as humans, we've had a major contribution in this biodiversity loss. We see all kinds of efforts to restore biodiversity, but maybe just to ask you, why do you think biodiversity loss is a problem? And why should we restore biodiversity? And why is nature of relevance? So I would just like to ask this open question, and then I can give you some answers. But first, some answers of you. Yep. Maybe you can wait for the mic.
Check. Because ecosystem services get lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And why is that a problem?
Because they are at the foundation of our food system, amongst other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the back.
We mess up with the balance of our ecosystem, so there's an equilibrium we are messing with.
Yeah, so indeed that an equilibrium is lost. Yeah,
exactly.
Any other ideas? Because of the light, sorry, yeah, I also see some hands over there. Yeah.
Because
I'm a bit blinded by the light, sorry. So there's a bias towards this part. Yeah?
Because we don't know the condition that we have to face in the future, and we might need the biodiversity in the future. So if we lost it.
Over there were also some hands.
I just wanted to say that we are all interdependent. So if we destroy the producers, the consumers, we will destroy also the top, predator that we are as.
Yeah, very good. So indeed, the loss of nature is also a problem for us as mankind. But of course, we also have a duty to be respectful of nature, right? Nature also has an intrinsic value of itself. But nature also provides all kinds of ecosystem services, it was already mentioned. Provisioning services like food and clean water, but also regulating services. So, for instance, vegetation in cities, for instance, can help buffer water and also protect against floods. But also diversity in agricultural systems can also reduce diseases. It can provide for natural pest control. Nature also has intrinsic, spiritual values, cultural values. Many human populations, they thrive with nature. They are really intrinsically combined with nature, not as we. I mean, we are separate from nature. And there are all kinds of supporting services that provide for healthy ecosystems that we have to use for harvesting wood or producing foods. And what you see is that, there's quite some evidence about the importance of ecosystem services. The IPBES, for instance, calculated that 1 out of 5 people on Earth, they really depend on wild species like plants, etc., for food and for income. Also, over half of gross domestic products worldwide is moderately or highly dependent on nature. The financial sector sees quite a substantial risk in the deterioration of ecosystem service and also call for action by our world leaders. So there's really something going on. And if we then conclude that nature and biodiversity is important for us, why do you think it's so difficult to mobilize action to restore biodiversity? So why, apparently, is it so difficult to bend this curve of biodiversity loss? Another question to you.
I feel like the language we use when we talk about nature and talk about humans' place within it, we have to be careful to remember, as you were saying, like, why is it important to keep biodiversity alive? Humans are nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every living, breathing cell of our body is nature. So I think it's interesting when we talk about ecosystem services, because that's a term that sort of characterizes the things that nature gives us as though it's a nice, like, service that they provide, when in fact those services are the very basis of our own survival as a species. So that was just what I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I mean, the whole idea behind talking in terms of ecosystem services is also to make us aware of the value of nature and that we're also part of it. But then back to this question, well, why is it so difficult? Yeah.
I would say because it goes against the industrialization. Intensive farming is expensive and you don't see an outcome right away. And we are used to have everything, whatever we want right away without having to listen to the rhythm of nature or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So short-termism versus long-termism? Yeah. So indeed, next to short-termism, it also requires differences of different values, structural changes in how, as society, we relate to nature. Yeah. Oh, Maaike, can you come back? Here's another hand. Oh, there also. Yeah.
Okay. So basically, just from the question, it's quite clear that there is hardly any space on Earth which is not occupied by humans, and there are hardly any forests left, right? So if we speak about restoration, there is hardly anything to restore, right?
Yeah, so people are everywhere, so we have an impact everywhere. Yeah. Okay, and then the last answer over here, because I was instructed that I really have to keep in time.
I think it's also a question about how our legal system is run. Human beings have all the rights. Nature has very little in terms of rights. Neither do animals, or hills or mountains, or it's all about property and owning and ownership.
Yeah, the legal system, indeed. So the way in which we relate to nature, indeed, is also found in legal systems and in value systems. Yeah, and in general, it has to do with conflicting interests, right? People can make money out of extraction of all kinds of natural resources, and it's short-term profits versus long-term burdens on society, burdens on nature. It also has to do with common pool problems. For instance, in fisheries, as an individual fisherman, I can take care of fish stocks and I cannot over-harvest. But if my colleagues, if my competitors do, then yeah, why should I be responsible in my fisheries, where if other ones don't? So we are all interdependent in what we do. There are also quite some knowledge gaps in ecological restoration. Not everything works, and there's also quite some knowledge to be produced over there. But there are also quite some different perspectives on what's the best way to restore nature. And there are different ideas so how to implement this. And important discussions are whether we should focus on restoration of habitats or whether we should focus on species. Should we restore, so bring back ecosystems as they were, and then maybe when, 80, 50? Or should we allow for evaluation, also in the face of climate change? Should we manage nature, or should we just leave nature as it is? And an important debate is about land sparing versus land sharing. Should we set aside nature, so leave nature untouched by humans, or is it better to provide for more space and less intensively manage our land so that also nature can thrive in culturally managed lands? This is quite a black and white discussion, because often we see that landscape like this, mosaic type landscapes, with small scale, a lot of landscape elements, a lot of diversity, usually host most biodiversity. And also we see all kinds of third ways between this land sharing, land sparing, that can also be useful for both for humans and for nature. And again, this is again a separation, artificial separation between man and nature. But just, I mean, we have had quite a role in the decline of biodiversity, so we also should be contributing to its restoration. Multifunctional landscape use is an example where nature and economic cultural activities can go together. Agroecology, or what we call nature-inclusive agriculture in the Netherlands, is also based on an efficient and smart and responsible use of ecosystem services rather than artificial inputs like fertilizer or agrochemicals, so as to produce food in a responsible way, taking care of particularly the soil. Nature-based solutions is an upcoming discourse, so the use of nature, the use of green in cities to also combat climate change in terms of urban heating, but also absorbing water to reduce flood risks, etc. Building with nature, for instance, using oyster banks to also to protect against floods, and so there are many more examples. So this just to get the big picture about biodiversity loss, why it is important to halt biodiversity loss, why it's important to bend the curve of biodiversity loss, and how we can work towards this. So you may have heard of Melbourne, you may have heard of the 30 times 30, 30 by 30 agreement, the idea that by 2030, at least 30% of the land and the seas and inland waters is under some form of nature protection in order to work towards biodiversity recovery. And that's not all. Globally, World Lead is also committed to providing a fund to particularly help low-income countries also to restore nature. So it is a very nice goal, very nice global goal. But what are its implications and how to work towards these goals, and particularly what are the governance challenges? Well, this is too big of a question to answer for the global situation. So I will zoom in and discuss the case of the Netherlands to give some flesh to the bones, so to say. So 30%. Situation now is 26% in the Netherlands. So 26% of the land, inland waters, coastal areas are now under some form of protection. So only 4% to go. That sounds like a very optimistic and positive view, but there are some problems, of course. I mean, as you know, biodiversity loss in the Netherlands is well, quite substantial, also compared worldwide. So there's something to be done. Because if you look at this 26%, there are different degrees of protection of natural areas. So we have very strict regimes, the Natura 2000, which follows from European legislation, and that's the most strict form of protection. This means that the assigned nature areas, in principle, nature first, human activities are not allowed unless there are really strong societal reasons. There are no alternatives, and there should be compensation. But this is a rather strict form for protection, and it also protects against external influences. So what we see now in the Netherlands, we have a nitrogen crisis for 4.5 years. This crisis has to do with Natura 2000 areas being under too much pressure from outside influences, too much nitrogen, as a consequence of which our habitats are in a poor condition. And yeah, well, the legal protection, the European laws say that we have to do something about it. But many parts of the Dutch nature areas are under the Nationaal Natuurnetwerk, which has a different protection regime, does not protect against external influences, and also well, there's more flexibility, so to say, in what is allowed and what's not allowed.
Is it then a correct measure?
No,
Like-
no, and that's my second point. So 30%, but it's good that you bring it up. I may have forgotten. This 30% is a means to an end, and the end is biodiversity protection and biodiversity restoration, right? And for this, you need to set aside land. You need to assign nature reserve areas. And that's the main problem, because even though we have 26% of land under some form of protection, we fail to meet the biodiversity targets that we committed to in European legislation. And that has to do with difficulties in managing these nature reserve areas, like the water tables, they are too low, but also because of external influences, particularly from agriculture. So this is European comparison. This shows how our habitats and our species are doing compared to the legal norms. And you see that, well, if you like biodiversity, you've chosen the wrong country to live in, so to say. There are better alternatives. And this has to do with primarily these pressures. It has to do with water management. So many of our nature reserve areas are too dry, and they are too dry because water tables are artificially lowered in order to enable particularly agriculture. There's also influences from manure, from nitrogen. And it sounds a bit strange, natural processes as a main driver of deterioration of ecosystems, but it has to do with grasses and these kinds of vegetation taking over, outcompeting rare species, which again has to do with, in large part, with agricultural practices. So if we want to move towards the 30% goal, and particularly the main goals, the higher goals, well, we need 4% extra nature. 4% sounds like not so much, but you have to think about an area the size of Utrecht. Well, where do we find such space? And biodiversity recovery requires more than assigning nature areas. We also need to better manage. We also need to reduce the external influences, particularly by agriculture. There's also the requirement to financially contribute to this compensation fund. And again, I want to stress that that's 30%. It's really only a means to an end. The end is biodiversity recovery. So very briefly, my field of expertise, I study governance. So I study the actions and the interactions between governments, companies, citizens, NGOs around societal problems. And governance usually means you try to convince actors, it can be individuals, can be organizations, can be farmers, to do something else than what they are doing now. Because governance is about solving problems. Problems emerge from the way in which we act. So governance also means trying to stimulate or even force actors to change their behavior. And that can be difficult. It has all to do with values, etc. But governance usually takes place by means of legal instruments, bans, for instance, or legal norms. Can also be by financial instruments, subsidies, taxes, but can also take place by means of information, governance, agreements, and these kinds of things. So then, what are the main governance challenges if we want to work towards 30 by 30? Assigning new nature reserve areas, particularly in this country where there are quite some competing land claims. We do not only have to build 900,000 extra houses, we have the energy transition, and then we also need to find more space for nature. The effective planning and management of these nature areas. So we have to do something with water tables. Reduce the external influence from agriculture, but also from other practices. We have to mobilize companies and governments and other actors to contribute to this fund. And we have to mainstream biodiversity concerns in the policies in other sectors, housing, infrastructure, because in many policy domains we can positively contribute to biodiversity. But this, of course, is quite a challenge because it's not mainstream in the way in which we work. So it requires quite some efforts. Well, not a surprise, there's also a main role for agriculture. And again, I'm now talking mainly about the Netherlands, but this also applies to other, particularly Western countries. Well, why is agriculture so important? Not only because it has quite a substantial impact on biodiversity, but also because it's the main land use. So about 50% of the Dutch land surface is in use for agriculture. And a large part of it, about 25% of total land surface is grasslands in use for dairy farming. So that's one main reason. If we have to find additional space, it will probably be, at least to some extent, the agricultural sector, because we are not going to destroy cities, I guess, to create more nature. Also in managing agricultural biodiversity, we already have quite a few farmers. I think about 20% of the arable and dairy farmers, so farmers who possess land, they are active in some form of agri-environment schemes. So they implement measures to conserve meadow birds or to conserve plants or whatever. But this also needs to be intensified because it's still not enough to stop the enormous loss of biodiversity in agricultural landscapes. Particularly in near nature reserve areas, agriculture has to become more or less intensive, so extensification is needed. We have to reduce cattle size over there, we have to reduce fertilization, but at the same time, we want to keep farmers there because otherwise the land is too expensive to manage. If you don't manage the land, if you don't manage the grasslands, it will turn into forests. But grasslands have quite some value, so it needs to be managed. And it's also important to realize that our intensive farming practices also have consequences elsewhere. So we import a lot of feed for our cattle, but it also means that in other places where feed is produced, also biodiversity loss occurs. So there's a lot to be done. But this sounds like agriculture and nature are contradicting. It's either or. But of course, we haven't invented agroecology or nature-inclusive agriculture for nothing. Agriculture also relies on ecosystem services, and it can rely much more on ecosystem services. For instance, we are working on grassland management, on dairy farming, and there is increasing evidence that more herb-rich grasslands can have a positive impact on the resilience of our grasslands to climate change. So we are starting to get used to droughts in summer, and this ryegrass, which we normally use, monocultures, they are very productive, but not under droughts. And there's increasing evidence, and we're also doing research into this, whether more diversity in grasslands, so more different herbs, can also contribute not only to biodiversity, but also to resilient dairy production. But then nature-inclusive agriculture also is problematic. It is very problematic for dairy farmers to switch from the current intensive practices to less intensive practices, to use less fertilizer, to rely more on manure, for instance, to implement herb-rich grasslands, to have a lower cattle size. These are all kinds of things that may be positive for nature, but impose all kinds of barriers to farmers. And important, this comes from a study that we conducted a few years ago with a team of researchers at Utrecht University, commissioned by the Ministry of Agriculture, and we identified a lot of problems, but 5 key problems. And the first key problem is that there's a lack of financial incentives. As we are sitting here together, we want to support farmers. We all buy organic dairy, organic vegetables. We are willing to pay a price, I'm sure, but the average consumer is not. And considering that 70–80% of all the produce that's produced here in the Netherlands is exported, it's really, it's a niche market. Most consumers are not willing to pay for Dutch agriculture or Dutch biodiversity. And on the other hand, there's also problems in terms of the prices of food. They do not reflect the true costs. So an intensive farmer whose practices go at the expense of biodiversity does not have to pay for it. But if you, as a dairy farmer, you want to contribute to biodiversity, that means that you fertilize less, that you postpone your mowing in order to have meadow birds breed and raise their chicks. You have lower income, and that's not compensated. So that's an important problem. That's the business model. But also many farmers, they have a limited action perspective. It's a very capital-intensive sector. I think by now the average price of an hectare of grassland is 65,000 euro. So imagine you're a farmer, new farmer, you have to buy land, you don't have land that's been in the family for a long time, then you have quite a high mortgage, and in the current system, that means you have to produce in order to pay the bank. So you have limited perspective. It's difficult then to extensify, so to say. There are all kinds of risks. It's uncertain how a more nature-inclusive agriculture, what it will yield to you. Everything can work differently depending on soil types. And banks then are reluctant to provide loans if there are uncertainties. So there are all kinds of problems. And if you have invested heavily, which most farmers have, then it's difficult to change your practices. Then there are also all kinds of problems in knowledge transfer. So sorry, I did look too much at your sides, but of course I love you as I love you all. Problems in knowledge transfer. So in the last decades, we have had quite a neoliberal regime. In the past, there was independent information transfer to farmers paid for by the public sector. But everything now has been liberalized, so farmers mostly get their information, get their advice from commercial advisors who want to sell their fertilizer, for instance, who do not have necessarily a benefit or an interest in advising about nature-inclusive agriculture. It's also not embedded in agricultural education, and it also has to do with, it's more complex. I mean, with lowering water tables with fertilizer, you can control environmental conditions. But if you want to work with environmental conditions, if you take that as a given and then try to work with ecosystem services, it's much more difficult. And what works on sand does not necessarily have to work on peats, for instance. Well, I mean, as an informed public, I mean, this should not be a surprise. What we hear constantly is that farmers do not have a perspective. They miss a long-term perspective of where the sector is going to. What does the government, what does the sector expect farmers to do 10, 20 years from now? And it's really problematic. You see that 2 ministers now already failed in providing such a perspective. And as long as you don't have a perspective on how you have to do things differently in the future, you're not going to invest in different practices. And it keeps everything in a lock-in situation. Nothing changes as long as there's no shared long-term perspective of how things should be different. And these are some examples of statements about what is needed for the dairy sector to change. So in the coalition agreement from the now demissionary cabinet, it was said that there needs to be a transition in agriculture. We really need a structural change in our in the way Dutch farming takes place, right? Political parties, they agree upon that this will be necessary. This is in sharp contrast to how the situation is felt among farmers. But also if you look at the policies that have been implemented by the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, they are really far from steering towards a transition. It's very much business as usual, all kinds of repair legislation in order to keep the sector within environmental limits, but it does not steer towards phasing out existing practices or providing a new perspective. And meanwhile, all kinds of terms, now it's regenerative agriculture, for instance, which is zooming around, but it's not concrete, and it's also not concrete whether this will be the new direction. And this all creates or contributes to a lot of resistance within the sector to change among farmers, but also among the agri-food companies who have a business model which is different from a business model that based on nature-inclusive agriculture. So summarizing, what are the main challenges? So I hopefully convince you that for meeting the 30 by 30 goals, and particularly for working towards biodiversity recovery in the Netherlands, there's a major role for agriculture. But for this, we need to overcome these structural barriers that dairy farmers face, and I guess they also apply to arable farming. But it also relates to overcoming differences in interests, differences in worldviews, differences in values, what's important, to agree upon a common vision on how we want to manage the land, how we want to manage the agricultural landscapes in the future, and what role for biodiversity. And that should not be biodiversity on top of other things, it should be an integral element. But thus far we failed to provide such a perspective. But such a perspective is needed, I think, and it can be differentiated. I think we have to work towards a model in which agriculture looks differently, depending on regional situations, on soil types, etc. But that should be the base, I think, for really structural change in the sector, but also in the ways in which the sector is governed. I think if we want to focus not only on food production, but also on the safeguarding and the enhancement of ecosystem services like biodiversity, but also clean air, clean soils, there's a larger role for government. And but maybe we can discuss about this later. So I started with the global, the big picture, then zoomed in a bit on the Netherlands, and then Dutch agricultural sector. I now would like to hand over to my colleague Dorine Rijmakers, who will zoom in even more to discuss what we can do on the campus in Utrecht.
Thank you. Hello. For the last slides, I will talk you through. I'm working at Utrecht University, not within one of the faculties, but I'm working at corporate offices. And I would like to show you what we're trying to do. One of the first things what was done was appointing a Biodiversity Council. Why did we do this? Well, actually it was seen in the COVID crisis, scientists advising the government, and a university has a lot of scientists, and why don't you use their expertise to advise the board of the university? So Hens is one of the members of the Biodiversity Council. And I think the most important thing is that now biodiversity has become a real stakeholder. If new decisions are taken upon the area owned by the university, for example, the council is involved. So somebody raises the hand and brings in the arguments needed to protect biodiversity. I think that's the most important part of the council, but of course there's also other impact of the council. What does the university do to strengthen and restore biodiversity? It's done in 3 different ways. The most global one, I would say, is to reduce its own ecological footprint. Think about sustainable traveling, zero waste, default vegetarian banqueting, reuse furniture and green energy and that kind of stuff. About the biodiversity of the area under own management, I'll come back in a moment. And the third one is to increase impact. It's not about impact for the university, but impact for biodiversity. Only 50% of the Dutch population is familiar with biodiversity. So if we use students, colleagues, the knowledge we have to share with the community, we do a good job for biodiversity. To come back to the area under own management, the area east of the city of Utrecht is called Utrecht Science Park. It's some peninsula belonging to the city, and it's surrounded at 3 sides by the estates of Zandwijk, Oostbroek and Amelisweert. And then there is the Utrecht Science Park, and it's about 350 hectares, and 150 is used by the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine. And they use it mainly to feed the cattle, since it's not very sustainable to import the food from Brazil or abroad. And also the dairy farm is organic, and then it's important to grow your own food so you know what they eat. The dairy part is organic, and it means that they use less nitrogen, just half the amount what the traditional farms use. But it's still a lot from a biodiversity perspective of view. You don't have many species in the pastures of the farm. And if we want to have a higher density of species, then we need less fertilizer. But if the farmer uses less fertilizer, the productivity drops down. Or he needs more land to grow the same amount of food. So, yeah, what did we do? We decided to make a blend of biodiversity and agriculture, which means that the faculty said, well, we can do with less cows for education and research. That makes 10 hectares, which can go to the biodiversity, and that can be converted into ecologically managed land. And that's what we can see from here. In dark green is the part we want to protect, that it's area that is already with a valuable nature. And we don't want to do anything else with it. These are the botanical gardens, for example. And in bright green, you see the part we want to impoverish. These are the verges and grass, which are spread all over the campus. And instead of 25 times mowing, we only do it twice a year, and we remove all the biomass, including the nitrogen and other nutrients, and in this way we can impoverish these parts, and altogether it's 34 hectares, so that's quite a huge area. And in this simple way, we could already make an oasis for insects within 2 years. And here in blue, you see the parts where we want to create ecological connections. This one, going from north to south, will be finished next year. And that's where green area will be formed. The green grasslands of the farm will be converted into ecologically maintained grasslands with higher biodiversity. It sounds simple, but of course there are also frictions. It's about the productivity I already mentioned, that there is less food for the cattle. But also, for example, we want to make pools in the ecological connection. And that means that the farmer is a little bit anxious for diseases, worms who can infect the cattle. And another thing is that when you only have one species growing, well, it's the grass for food. But if there are a lot of more species, you get maybe also species which can be toxic for the cattle. And yeah, about all these things you have to talk with each other and act together. So this is just a small example of what we are doing in Utrecht. We are also a partner in the national Delta Plan for biodiversity restoration. And many more companies are involved. So if everybody in the Netherlands is taking care for a small part, biodiversity can increase. And I think this is the last slide we have. And thank you. And of course, there will be questions.
Help me get through the time. Help me say goodbye to all of my fears that are surreal. Having no time is scary.